The next morning Wogan was tossing from side to side in a high fever. The fever itself was of no great importance, but it had consequences of a worldwide influence, for it left Wogan weak and tied to his bed, so that it was Gaydon who travelled to Rome and obtained the Pope's passport. Gaydon consequently saw what otherwise Wogan would have seen, and Gaydon, the cautious, prudent Gaydon, was careful to avoid making an inopportune discovery, whereas Wogan would never have rested until he had made it. Gaydon stayed in Rome a week, lying snug and close in a lodging only one street removed from that house upon the Tiber where his king lived. Secrets had a way of leaking out, and Gaydon was determined that this one should not through any inattention of his. He therefore never went abroad until dark, and even then kept aloof from the house which overlooked the Tiber. His business he conducted through his servant, sending him to and fro between Edgar, the secretary, and himself. One audience of his king alone he asked, and that was to be granted him on the day of his departure from Rome. Thus the time hung very heavily upon him. Page 129. From daybreak to dusk he was cooped within a little insignificant room which looked out upon a little insignificant street. His window, however, though it promised little diversion, was his one resource. Gaydon was a man of observation, and found a pleasure in guessing at this and that person's business from his appearance, his dress, and whether he went fast or slow. So he sat steadily at his window, and after a day or two had passed he began to be puzzled. The moment he was puzzled he became interested. On the second day he drew his chair a little distance back from the window and watched. On the third day he drew his chair close to the window, but at the side and against the wall. In this way he could see everything that happened and everyone who passed, and yet remain himself unobserved. Almost opposite to his window stood a small mean house fallen into neglect and disrepair. The windows were curtained with dust, many of the panes were broken, the shutters hung upon broken hinges, the paint was peeling from the door. The house had the most melancholy aspect of long disuse. It seemed to belong to no one and to be crumbling pitifully to ruin like an aged man who has no friends. Yet this house had its uses, which Gaydon could not but perceive were of a secret kind. On the very first day that Gaydon sat at his window a man, who seemed from his dress to be of a high consideration, came sauntering along that sordid thoroughfare, where he seemed entirely out of place, like a butterfly, page 130, on the high seas. To Gaydon's surprise he stopped at the door, gave a cautious look round, and rapped quickly with his stick. At once the door of that uninhabited house was opened. The man entered, the door was closed upon him, and a good hour by Gaydon's watch elapsed before it was opened again to let him out. In the afternoon another man came and was admitted with the same secrecy. Both men had worn their hats drawn down upon their foreheads, and whereas one of them held a muffler to his face, the other had thrust his chin within the folds of his cravat. Gaydon had not been able to see the face of either. After nightfall he remarked that such visits became more frequent. Moreover, they were repeated on the next day and the next. Gaydon watched, but never got any nearer to a solution of the mystery. At the end of the sixth day he was more puzzled and interested than ever, for closely as he had watched he had not seen the face of any man who had passed in and out of that door. But he was to see a face that night. At 9 o'clock a messenger from Edgar, the secretary, brought him a package which contained a letter and the passport for these 6 days delayed. The letter warned him that Edgar himself would come to fetch him in the morning to his audience with James. The passport gave authority to a Flemish nobleman, the Count of Cernes, to make a pilgrimage to Loretto with his wife and family. The name of Warner had served its turn and could no longer be employed. Page 131. As soon as the messenger had gone, Gaydon destroyed Edgar's letter, put the passport safely away in his breast, and since he had not left his room that day, put on his hat. Being a prudent man with a turn for economy, he also extinguished his lamp. He had also a liking for fresh air, so he opened the window, and at the same moment the door of the house opposite was opened. A tall burly man with a lantern in his hand stepped out into the street. He was followed by a slight man of a short stature. Both men were wrapped in their cloaks, but the shorter one tripped on a break in the road and his cloak fell apart. His companion turned at once and held his lantern aloft. Just for a second the light therefore flashed upon a face, and Gaydon at his dark window caught a glimpse of it. The face was the face of his king. Gaydon was more than ever puzzled. He had only seen the face for an instant, moreover, he was looking down upon it, so that he might be mistaken. He felt, however, that he was not, and he began to wonder at the business that could take his king to this mysterious house. But there was one thing of which he was sure amidst all his doubts: Rome was not the safest city in the world for a man to walk about at nights. His king would be none the worse off for a second guardian who would follow near enough to give help and far enough for discretion. Gaydon went down his stairs into the street. The lantern twinkled ahead. Gaydon followed it until it stopped before a great house which had lights burning, page 132, here and there in the windows. The smaller man mounted the steps and was admitted. His big companion with the lantern remained outside. Gaydon, wishing to make sure of his conjectures one way or the other, walked quickly past him and stole a glance sideways at his face. But the man with the lantern looked at Gaydon at the same moment. Their eyes met, and the lantern was immediately held aloft. "It is Major Gaydon." Gaydon had to make the best of the business. He bowed. "Mr. Whittington, I think." "Sir," said Whittington, politely, "I am honored by your memory. For myself, I never forget a face though I see it but for a moment between the light and the dark, but I do not expect the like from my acquaintances. We did meet, I believe, in Paris? You are of Dillon's regiment?" "And on leave in Rome," said Gaydon, a trifle hastily. "On leave," said Whittington, idly. "Well, so far as towns go, Rome is as good as another, though, to tell the truth, I find them all quite unendurable. Would I were on leave! But I am pinned here, a watchman with a lantern. I do but lack a rattle, though, to be sure, I could not spring it. We are secret tonight, Major. Do you know what house this is?" "No," replied Gaydon. "But I am waited for and will bid you good night." Page 133. He had a thought that the Chevalier, since he would be secret, had chosen his watchman rather ill. He had no wish to pry, and so was for returning to his lodging, but that careless, imprudent man, Whittington, would not lose a companion so easily. He caught Gaydon by the arm. "Well, it is the house of Maria Vittoria, Mademoiselle de Caprera, the heiress of Bologna, who has only this evening come to Rome. And so no later than this evening I am playing link boy, appointed by letters patent, one might say. But what will you? Youth is youth, whether in a ploughboy or a, but my tongue needs a gag. Another word, and I had said too much. Well, since you will be going, good night. We shall meet, no doubt, in a certain house that overlooks the Tiber." "Hardly," said Gaydon, "since I leave Rome tomorrow." "Indeed? You leave Rome tomorrow," said Whittington. "I would I were as fortunate," and he jerked his thumb dolefully towards the Caprera Palace. Gaydon hesitated for a moment, considering whether or not he should ask Whittington to be silent upon their meeting. But he determined the man was too incautious in his speech. If he begged him not to mention Gaydon's presence in Rome, he would remember it the more surely, and if nothing was said he might forget it. Gaydon wished him good night and went back to his lodging, walking rather moodily. Whittington looked after him and chuckled. Page 134. Meanwhile, in a room of the house two people sat, one the slight, graceful man who had accompanied Whittington and whom Gaydon had correctly guessed to be his king, the other, Maria Vittoria de Caprera. The Chevalier de St. George was speaking awkwardly with a voice which broke. Maria listened with a face set and drawn. She was a girl both in features and complexion of a remarkable purity. Of color, but for her red lips, she had none. Her hair was black, her face of a clear pallor which her hair made yet more pale. Her eyes matched her hair, and were so bright and quick a starry spark seemed to glow in the depths of them. She was a poet's simile for night. The Chevalier ended and sat with his eyes turned away. Maria Vittoria did not change her attitude, nor for a while did she answer, but the tears gathered in her eyes and welled over. They ran down her cheeks. She did not wipe them away, she did not sob, nor did her face alter from its fixity. She did not even close her eyes. Only the tears rained down so silently that the prince was not aware of them. He had even a thought as he sat with his head averted that she might have shown a trifle more of distress, and it was almost with a reproach upon his lips that he turned to her. Never was a man more glad that he had left a word unspoken. This silent grief of tears cut him to the heart. "Maria," he cried, and moved towards her. She made no gesture to repel him, she did not move, but she spoke in a whisper. Page 135. His Holiness the Pope had consented to our marriage. What would I not have done for you? The Chevalier stooped over her and took her hand. The hand remained inert in his. "Maria! Would that I were poor. Would that I were powerless. But I am rich, so rich. I could have done so much. I am alone, so much alone. What would I not have done for you? Maria!" His voice choked upon the word, his lips touched her hair, and she shivered from head to foot. Then her hand tightened fast upon his, she drew him down almost fiercely until he sank upon his knees by her side, she put an arm about his shoulder and held him to her breast. "But you love me," she said quickly. "Tell me so. Say, I love you, I love you, I love you. Oh, that we both could die, you saying it, I hearing it, die tonight, like this, my arm about you, your face against my heart. My lord, and then she flung him from her, holding him at arm's length. Say it with your eyes on mine. I can see though the tears fall. I shall never hear the words again after tonight. Do not stint me of them, let them flow just as these tears flow. They will leave no more trace than do my tears." "Maria, I love you," said the Chevalier. "How I do love you." He took her hands from his shoulders and pressed his forehead upon them. She leaned forward, and in a voice so low it seemed, page 136, her heart was whispering, not her mouth, she made her prayer. "Say that you have no room in your thoughts except for me. Say that you have no scrap of love." He dropped her hands and drew away, she caught him to her. "No, no. Say that you have no scrap of love to toss to the woman there in Innsbruck." "Maria," he exclaimed. "Hush," said she, with a waffle smile. "Tomorrow you shall love her, tomorrow I will not ask your eyes to dwell on mine or your hand to quiver as it touches mine. But tonight love no one but me." For answer he kissed her on the lips. She took his head between her hands and gave the kiss back, gently as though her lips feared to bruise his, slowly as though this one moment must content her for all her life. Then she looked at him for a little, and with a childish movement that was infinitely sad she laid his face side by side with hers so that his cheek touched hers. "Shall I tell you my thought?" she asked. "Shall I dare to tell you it?" "Tell it me." "God has died tonight. Hush. Do not move. Do not speak. Perhaps the world will slip and crumble if we but stay still." And they remained thus cheek to cheek silent in the room, staring forward with eyes wide open and hopeful. The very air seemed to them aquiver with expectation. Page 137, they, too, had an expectant smile upon their lips. But there was no crack of thunder overhead, no roar of a slipping world. Cheek to cheek, silent in the room, staring forward with eyes wide open and hopeful. Page 136. The Chevalier was the first to move. "But we are children," he cried, starting up. "Is it not strange the very pain which tortures us because we are man and woman should sink us into children? We sit hoping that a miracle will split the world in pieces. This is the Caprera Palace, Whittington drowses outside over his lantern, and tomorrow Gaydon rides with his passport northwards to Charles Wogan." The name hurt Maria Vittoria like a physical torture. She beat her hands together with a cry, "I hate him! I hate him! Yet I have no better servant. Speak no good word of him in my ears. He robs me of you. He risks his life for me. I will pray that he may lose it. Maria!" The Chevalier started, thrilled and almost appalled by the violence of her passion. "I do pray," she cried. "Every fiber in me tingles with the prayer. Oh, I hate him. Why did you give him leave to rescue her? Could I refuse? I did delay him, I did hesitate. Only today Gaydon receives the passport, and even so I have delayed too long. Indeed, Maria, I dare not think of the shame, the danger, Her Highness has endured for me, lest my presence, page 138, here, even for this farewell, should too bitterly reproach me." At that all Maria Vittoria's vehemence left her. She fell to beseechings and entreaties. With her vehemence went also her dignity. She dropped upon her knees and dragged herself across the room to him. To James her humility was more terrible than her passion, for passion had always distinguished her, and he was familiar with it, but pride had always gone hand in hand with it. He stepped forward and would have raised her from the ground, but Maria would have none of his help. She crouched at his feet pleading. "You told me business would call you to Spain. Go there. Stay there. For a little, oh, not for long. But for a month, say, after your princess comes triumphing into Bologna. Promise me that. I could not bear that you should meet her as she comes. There would be shouts, I can hear them. No, I will not have it. I can see her proud cursed face a flush. No. You think too much of what she has suffered. If I could have suffered too. But suffering, shame, humiliation, these fall to women, always have fallen. We have learnt to bear them so that we feel them less than you. My dear lord, believe me. Her suffering is no great thing. If we love, we welcome it. Each throb of pain endured for love becomes a thrill of joy. If I could have suffered too. It was strange to hear this girl with the streaming eyes and tormented face bewail her fate in that, page 139, she had not won that great privilege of suffering. She knelt on the ground a splendid image of pain, and longed for pain that she might prove thereby how little a thing she made of it. The Chevalier drew a stool to her side and seating himself upon it clasped her about the waist. She laid her cheek upon his knee just as a dog will do. "Sweetheart," said he, "I would have no woman suffer a pang for me had I my will of the world. But since that may not be, I do not believe that any woman could be deeper hurt than you are now." Not Clementina? No. Maria uttered a little sigh. Her pain gave her a sort of ownership of the man who caused it. "Nor can she love as deep," she continued quietly. "A Sobieski from the snows. Love was born here in Italy. She robs me of you. I hate her." Then she raised her face eagerly. "Charles Wogan may fail. You do not know him. The cleverest have made mistakes and died for them. Wogan makes mistakes like another, but somehow gets the better of them in the end. There was a word he said to me when he begged for my permission. I told him his plan was a mere dream. He answered he would dream it true. He will. You should have waked him. You were the master, he the servant. You were the king. And when can the king do what he wills instead, page 140, of what he must? Maria, if you and I had met before I sent Charles Wogan to search out a wife for me. Maria Vittoria knelt up. She drew herself away. He chose her as your wife? If only I had had time to summon him back. He chose her, Charles Wogan. How I hate him. I sent him to make the choice. And he might have gone no step beyond Bologna. There was I not a mile distant ready to his hand. But I was too mean, too despicable. Maria, hush. And the troubled voice in which she spoke rang with so much pain that she was at once contrite with remorse. My lord, I hurt you, so you see how I am proven mean. Give me your hand and laugh to me, laugh with your heart and eyes and lips. I am jealous of your pain. I am a woman. I would have it all, gather it all into my bosom, and cherish each sharp stab like a flower my lover gives to me. I am glad of them. They are flowers that will not wither. Add a kiss, sweetheart, the sharpest stab, and so the chief flower, the very rose of flowers. There, that is well, and she rose from her knees and turned away. So she stood for a little, and when she turned again she wore upon her face the smile which she had bidden rise in his. Would we were free, cried the Chevalier. But since we are not, let us show brave faces to the world and hide our hearts. I do wish you all, page 141, happiness. But you will go to Spain. There's a friend's hand in warrant of the wish. She held out a hand which clasped his firmly without so much as a tremor. Good night, my friend, said she. Speak those same words to me, and no word more. I am tired with the day's doings. I have need of sleep, oh, great need of it. The Chevalier read plainly the overwhelming strain her counterfeit of friendliness put upon her. He dared not prolong it. Even as he looked at her, her lips quivered and her eyes swam. Good night, my friend, said he. She conducted him along a wide gallery to the great staircase where her lackeys waited. Then he bowed to her and she curtsied low to him, but no word was spoken by either. This little comedy must needs be played in pantomime lest the actors should spoil it with a show of broken hearts. Maria Vittoria went back to the room. She could have hindered Wogan if she had had the mind. She had the time to betray him, she knew of his purpose. But the thought of betrayal never so much as entered her thoughts. She hated him, she hated Clementina, but she was loyal to her king. She sat alone in her palace, her chin propped upon her hands, and in a little in her wide unblinking eyes the tears gathered again and rolled down her cheeks and on her hands. She wept silently and without a movement, like a statue weeping. Page 142. The Chevalier found Whittington waiting for him, but the candle in his lantern had burned out. I have kept you here a wearisome long time, he said with an effort. It was not easy for him to speak upon an indifferent matter. I had some talk with Major Gaydon which helped me to beguile it, said Whittington. Gaydon, exclaimed the Chevalier, are you certain? A man may make mistakes in the darkness, said Whittington. To be sure. And I never had an eye for faces. It was not Gaydon, then, said the Chevalier. It may not have been, said Whittington, and by the best of good fortune I said nothing to him of any significance whatever. The Chevalier was satisfied with the reply. He had chosen the right attendant for this nocturnal visit. Had Gaydon met with a more observant man than Whittington outside the Caprara Palace, he might have got a number of foolish suspicions into his head. Gaydon, however, was at that moment in his bed, saying to himself that there were many matters concerning which it would be an impertinence for him to have one meddlesome thought. By God's blessing he was a soldier and no politician. He fell asleep comforted by that conclusion. In the morning Edgar, the Chevalier's secretary, came privately to him. Page 143. "The king will receive you now," said he. "Let us go. It is broad daylight. We shall be seen." "Not if the street is empty," said Edgar, looking out of the window. The street, as it chanced, was for the moment empty. Edgar crossed the street and rapped quickly with certain pauses between the raps on the door of that deserted house into which Gaydon had watched men enter. The door was opened. "Follow me," said Edgar. Gaydon followed him into a bare passage unswept and with discolored walls. A man in a little hutch in the wall opened and closed the door with a string. Edgar walked forward to the end of the passage with Gaydon at his heels. The two men came to a flight of stone steps, which they descended. The steps led to a dark and dripping cellar with no pavement but the mud, and that depressed into puddles. The air was cold and noisome, the walls to the touch of Gaydon's hand were greasy with slime. He followed Edgar across the cellar into a sort of tunnel. Here Edgar drew an end of candle from his pocket and lighted it. The tunnel was so low that Gaydon, though a shortish man, could barely hold his head erect. He followed Edgar to the end and up a flight of winding steps. The air grew warmer and drier. They had risen above ground, the spiral wound within the thickness of a wall. The steps ended abruptly, there was no door visible, in face of them and on each side the bare stone walls enclosed, page 144, them. Edgar stooped down and pressed with his finger on a round insignificant discoloration of the stone. Then he stood up again. "You will breathe no word of this passage, Major Gaydon," said he. "The house was built a century ago when Rome was more troubled than it is today, but the passage was never more useful than now. Men from England, whose names it would astonish you to know, have trodden these steps on a secret visit to the king. Ah!" From the wall before their faces a great slab of the size of a door sank noiselessly down and disclosed a wooden panel. The panel slid aside. Edgar and Gaydon stepped into a little cabinet lighted by a single window. The room was empty. Gaydon took a peep out of the window and saw the Tiber eddying beneath. Edgar went to a corner and touched a spring. The stone slab rose from its grooves, the panel slid back across it. At the same moment the door of the room was opened, and the Chevalier stepped across the threshold. Gaydon could no longer even pretend to doubt who had walked with Whittington to the Caprara Palace the night before. It was none of his business, however, he assured himself. If his king dwelt with emphasis upon the dangers of the enterprise, it was not his business to remark upon it or to be thereby disheartened. The king said very graciously that he would hold the major and his friends in no less esteem if by any misfortune they came back empty-handed. That was most kind of, page 145, him, but it was none of Gaydon's business. The king was ill at ease and looked as though he had not slept a wink the livelong night. Well, swollen eyes and a patched pallid face disfigure all men at times, and in any case they were none of Gaydon's business. He rode out of Rome that afternoon as the light was failing. He rode at a quick trot, and did not notice at the corner of a street a big stalwart man who sauntered along swinging his stick by the tassel with a vacant look of idleness upon the passers-by. He stopped and directed the same vacant look at Gaydon. But he was thinking curiously, will he tell Charles Wogan? The stalwart man was Harry Whittington. Gaydon, however, never breathed a word about the Caprera Palace when he handed the passport to Charles Wogan at Schlestadt. Wogan was sitting propped up with pillows in a chair, and he asked Gaydon many questions of the news at Rome, and how the king bore himself. The king was not in the best of spirits, said Gaydon. With this, cried Wogan, flourishing the passport, we'll find a means to hearten him. Gaydon filled a pipe and lighted it. Will you tell me, Wogan, he asked, I am by nature curious, was it the king who proposed this enterprise to you, or was it you who proposed it to the king? Page 146. The question had an extraordinary effect. Wogan was startled out of his chair. What do you mean? He exclaimed fiercely. There was something more than fierceness in the words, an accent of fear, it almost seemed to Gaydon. There was a look almost of fear in his eyes, as though he had let some appalling secret slip. Gaydon stared at him in wonder, and Wogan recovered himself with a laugh. Faith, said he, it is a question to perplex a man. I missed out, but we both had the thought about the same time. Wogan, said he, there's the princess with a chain on her leg, so to speak, and I answered him, a chain's a galling sort of thing to a lady's ankle. There was little more said if I remember right. Gaydon nodded as though his curiosity was now satisfied. Wogan's alarm was strange, no doubt, strange and unexpected, like the Chevalier's visit to the Caprera Palace. Gaydon had a glimpse of dark and troubled waters, but he turned his face away. They were none of his business. Page 147.